Hi, and welcome to Maybe Running Will Help, the show that explores the why of running for people who love to run. I'm your host, Nicky, also known as One Classy Mother Runner on Instagram. I know a thing or two about running and how it transforms lives. From confidence to humility and goal crushing to soul crushing, I've personally experienced the highs and lows of our sport. What I've come to realize is that running is about more than performance and PRs, and that's exactly what this show's about. Together, we'll explore the deeper why of running through stories and conversations that inspire, challenge, and connect us. If you love what you're hearing and want to support the show, please leave a review on your favorite platform. Share your review on social media and tag us on Instagram at Maybe Running Will Help to get a free podcast sticker as a thank you. Now, let's get started. Zach Bitter, welcome to the Maybe Running Will Help podcast. I'm so honored to talk to you today. I'm a huge fan.
Well, thanks for having me, and hopefully running will help.
I mean, everybody that I've talked to is basically like, stop stating it as a question. Everybody knows running will help. So
we're biased, but we'll go with that.
Yeah. It's so funny because it's like, no matter like what is going on or what's happening, it's like the first thing I think, I'm like, maybe going for a run will help. And it does. So yeah, it's every day a question in my mind. But yeah, so it's so awesome to talk to you. For people who maybe aren't familiar with who you are, you're an American world record holder right now for the 100 miler, right? Like that's your big record right now. Is that, would you say that's your biggest accomplishment?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah,
Okay.
I broke the American record in 2013, turned that somewhat briefly into a world record in 2019, and then it came back as an American record, but it still holds for that. So I would say that's my best performance to date.
It's insane because your pace is like my best marathon pace. It's like 6:47 is what it comes down to, right? Per mile.
Yeah. And I mean, ultra's funny too, because it's getting more recognized, I think, in the broader running community, and people are wrapping their heads around like what, you talk about the marathon and people have a general idea oftentimes of like what a specific pace and what a specific finishing time kind of suggests. But ultra's weird because we have so many different environments that you race in that it gets really kind of murky as to like, how do you compare something on a 400-meter track to the mountains out in Colorado or something like that. So it does get a little more difficult. I think I probably present a little bit of an easier way to wrap your head around it, given the controlled nature of the stuff I do, where you do 6:47 on something really flat and you start looking at it. Usually if you tell people like it's basically 4 consecutive sub 3-hour marathons, then they're kind of like, okay, I can kind of understand and get an idea of what went into all of that.
Right. Oh, that's such a good point. I actually didn't even think about like that. When you were first starting to talk about like conceptualizing it, I was even being like, I don't even know what a good time is for anything over a marathon. Like, hearing 12 hours for 100 miles, like to me, I'm like, of course, like if I think about it, I can be like, that's good. But I like off the top of my head, like if somebody says 3 hours or under for a marathon, I'm like, oh, that's fast. But like for an ultra, I like just have no concept of what it is. But I didn't even think about the different terrains and stuff. Do you like the other terrains? Do you do other ultras where there's more elevation and things like that? Or do you typically stick to trying to beat that record?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I love the trails. I love everything about ultra. It is one of those things where you have a certain amount of time and energy, so you got to get a little picky at a certain point. And I definitely always come back to the flat runnable hundreds. And I think one of the reasons for that is in 2013, when I broke the American record for 100 and the world record for 12 hours, it was like a different experience for me compared to some of the races I'd done in the past. And it just like generated this question in my mind that I essentially ask myself every day, which is like, how fast can you run 100 miles when you try to optimize for it with respect to finding an environment that is conducive for essentially just running as fast as you possibly could. And I've just stayed interested in that question every day since then. And I've always said, like, if I get to a point where I run a race where I'm like, I just don't think I can go any faster, then maybe I would move on to something else. I guess I just haven't entirely answered that question for myself yet. It's possible I have, but I need more time to discover that. And and potentially fail a few more times, or maybe succeed and reset the benchmark for myself a little bit.
That's crazy. So you're trying to like optimize like 100 miles. Like that's actually insane. Is that your favorite distance then?
Yeah, I
For
really
sure.
like it. Yeah, because I think it's long enough where it differentiates itself enough from the traditional endurance stuff, but it does still have a pretty heavy component in things like running efficiency, which is a part of the sport I really do love. I mean, ultra running has gotten a lot more popular the last few years
Yeah.
within just some of these like multi-day type events too, where now running efficiencies is still important. Like you're not going to find somebody at the top of a podium at these 200 plus milers that doesn't have reasonably good running efficiency, but there's a much lower bar where going much above that, if it comes at the expense of some of these other variables like durability, just being able to like navigate things like running through a couple of nights without sleeping and a bunch of other variables that are just as important when you get into the thick of it, it just becomes a little bit of a lesser thing where I think the 100 mile still has quite a bit of that running efficiency variable kind of leading the charge. But then there is the other things like the nutritional stuff, the proper pacing. You're essentially optimizing for aerobic threshold the way you maybe would for lactate threshold if you were like a top tier marathon runner. So it's kind of got a lot of the same characteristics, just at a different intensity.
Yeah. So you're into like the scientific like side of it and really like figuring nutrition and stuff out of it where like maybe another ultra runner like they're like in it for survival, like the survival like aspects, right? Like you're going out and you're like having to figure out like I mean, I'm sure you have too, but like I just think about like like I would never make it navigationally or like with wildlife. Like it's just so different. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and there's an appeal to me to that too.
Huh.
I wouldn't say it's my primary interest, but it's definitely a powerful enough one where I get really interested. And like right now, I remain a fan of the multi-day stuff. Where on my
Yeah.
podcast, I've had a bunch of the multi-day runners on,
Yeah,
the
right.
backyard ultra stuff on,
Yeah.
and I love it because it's like like my podcast has kind of like evolved a lot over the years. I started it a long time ago, and at first I didn't want it to really focus on ultra running or running at all, really,
Okay.
because it was like, okay, this is going to be a little bit of a different outlet that I can do that is different than running because I was spending so much time and energy focused on running and coaching, and I was like, okay, I need something different. And then like over the years, I kind of like moved it more and more towards like athletics, and then like running, and then heavily ultra running now. So like I've just sort of like gotten enough interest in things within the sport that I haven't done much of.
Yeah.
And I found a real value add in especially some of these more fringe events that have less science
Yeah.
backing the approaches. And there's just a wider range of protocols that are out there on the table. It's like you just kind of got to go to the races. You got to talk to the people that are doing it. And, you know, on the coaching side, it's like I got enough clients now that are doing these races. It behooves me to do what I'm doing with respect to talking to the people doing it, looking at what research we do have, and eventually doing one, I guess, because that's probably the next step for me from a coaching
Right.
perspective, is even if I don't find it to be something I want to try to maybe find my outermost potential in the way I've tried to with the 100 mile, it is something I think the experience itself can teach you a lot. And
Yeah.
that draw of the unknown is part of the other powerful part of the what I think what the why would be for me is just all right, I kind of know what's going to happen in a 100 mile race if things go good, bad, or great. I don't know that with respect to something that could take me 2, 3 days. So
Yeah.
that is an interesting kind of characteristic that a lot of people in the ultra running sphere kind of gravitate towards, which is just you typically see them like constantly moving up in distance or going
Hmm.
to different types of courses because it kind of reintroduces that unknown that they maybe had more or less problem solved for in a larger capacity if they just kind of repeated the same event over and over again.
Yeah. No, I that's terrifying to me. I get it. I get the allure of it, but like having to like problem solve, especially in the wild, is just terrifying. That's why I'm like, I need ultra crude. I'm still sticking to the marathon. Like I've thought in my head about doing an ultra because I too, like with my podcast, when I started it, it was more like I want to figure out the reasons that we run that have nothing to do with performance. I was at a point in my running where I was just like getting burnout of always trying to like PR and PR. And I was like, but I know there are other benefits to running that aren't just performance related. So that's like originally how I started talking to people. And I didn't want to talk about like performance or results. I just wanted to be like, why do you run that benefits you outside of like going to a race or whatever? But God, people are amazing. And I just keep seeing all these like just fascinating things that people are doing, and it's mostly in the ultra space right now, and it just blows my mind. So now I'm just trying to get inside of the heads of people like you and like other people that are doing these things that I find absolutely like terrifying, and like why, like what is it about like doing these super hard things that makes you keep coming back to them, because it's like not always fun, you know what I mean? Like training
Mhm.
like you train can't, I mean, it can't be fun all the time. So like what gets you up in the morning, like, to get out there and do your workouts and stuff?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I definitely learned to enjoy that process of kind of creating difficulty, creating adversity so that you can prove to yourself that you can kind of do something when you maybe don't want to. It is a fine line, especially when you kind of get into the professional side of things where, there's a line you don't want to cross too often where you just get burnt out or you start having diminishing returns from doing more than you should or trying to push through things you should be resting from. You have to find that. But generally speaking, I do find it's like 2/3 of the running I do is like quite enjoyable. It's like the whole thing was fun. It was great. I could almost do it on autopilot and get all the health benefits and everything that kind of comes with an active lifestyle. But then there's that next part where it's like you're peaking for a race or you're trying to improve an adaptation with respect to say like short intervals at VO2 max or long intervals at lactate threshold. And then there's going to be a part where it's got to be hard because like your body isn't going to respond to easy. It's going to respond to hard. So dosing that properly, I just really like that process though, where it's going to be difficult. You're going to learn something from that difficulty. You're going to reconfirm, this idea that you've built in your head that you can do hard things and that can be transferable to other areas of your life. I think it's just a necessary input for humans, especially in the kind of the modern world. I kind of learned that really early in my running journey, and I think partly that was because I wasn't great. Like I didn't run in high school or college with any sort of projection towards professionalism within the sport. It was like I was good enough to make the state meet at a small school in high school. I was good enough to make a very competitive Division 3 college program, but I wasn't going to be like, a top scorer at nationals or anything like that or all American. So it was always just something where I kind of had to learn about what am I doing this for? I had to ask myself that question because it wasn't like, oh, I'm doing this to become an All American or I'm doing this to, be a top scorer on our cross country team. Or I'm doing this because I've got this Olympic dream ahead of me or something like that. And these are the necessary steps to get there. So I think I just like inadvertently learned that along the way that if this is something I'm going to invest as much time and energy as I do into, I have to find where the value is in it outside of just the performance side of things. And I think I've carried that over into the spot of the sport that I have found over the years where I could behave as a professional to some capacity. And I think that's been helpful with respects to staying consistent and staying out there because I just have a very strong why as to that of how I would be doing or what I would be doing, even if the results weren't there.
Yeah, I mean, how do you keep your motivation, like, more intrinsic than especially, like, performing like you do, having set, like, records and things like that? How do you not get caught up in, like, the pressure to perform from the outside?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say it's easy, but it is something where you just have to continually remind yourself why you're there. So, like, it's not something where like I just go through this whole thing with like this excellent shield where I don't see any of the stuff around like the performance side of it or the expectations around performance, even the stuff set for myself too, because no one could care, and I could still set a performance expectation that I fall short of or that I feel I have to try to live up to. And you see that comes in. It tests you from time to time, but I think usually when you have an authentic why within why you're doing it outside of that, you can always come back to that and just kind of place your faith in, okay, well, this is why I'm really here. Stay focused on that. And I just think that learning that your mind is going to do that to you is just a powerful tool across the board, whether it's in your training, in a race, or some other area in life, because that's what it's always going to do. It's always going to find a spot when you're kind of a little more vulnerable, where you're letting some doubt come in, and then it's going to try to like exasperate that to seek comfort or to cope because you want to feel good about yourself when maybe you should be reflecting on what you're doing. And I just find that to be a really interesting kind of human experience, I guess, that running gives you the opportunity to continually do, where you're not always perfect at it, but you try to get better at catching it when it comes up and going back to the core of what you've put your trust and faith into.
Yeah. Have you ever had to take time off, whether it's because you've been burnt out or I mean, I know that like even now you're dealing with sort of an injury with the blood clot that stuff that's going on. But have you ever had to take a significant amount of time off and just then realize like how important it is to you to kind of do hard things like you were talking about?
Yeah, I haven't had too many scenarios where I felt really just burnt out, where I was like, my body is still performing well, but I'm just like, for whatever reason, I'm like falling short of, yeah, I'm losing interest. I've had a few that I've gotten to that kind of spot. I would say like after my college career, I got into kind of high mileage training and I started consistently running like 100-mile weeks. And it was during a phase of my life where I was student teaching, so there's a lot of newness there. And I just kind of hit a threshold where I think I probably like was burning the candle on both ends a little too much, and I just said, okay, this isn't sustainable. So I just like shut it down for a month. And then after a month, the excitement and energies kind of came back, and then I just kind of got back to it. And I think that was maybe one of the earlier points in my career where I kind of like was testing some of the boundaries of how much you can kind of get away with before you need to start looking at it as, okay, more is not necessarily better. And you touch the stove, get burnt, you try not to
Mhm.
touch that stove again after that.
Right.
um yeah, a lot of my I've had like I had a stretch then basically from college through like the first 10 years of my running after that. If we go back into college, probably more like 15 years, where I really didn't have a whole lot of injuries at all. I think it was like before 2021, I think I had maybe one injury that meaningfully costed me the ability to do the race I wanted to do, where I've had somewhere I went in a little compromised because I had some like little things pop up where it's like, I didn't quite get the training I wanted in, but I'm healthy enough and ready enough to at least go there and see what I have on this particular event and then kind of start the process over again after an off season. But I didn't really have a lot of stuff like that. I had a really bad ankle injury. I think it was in 2021. Yeah, 2021, second half of the year. And that it was like partial tears on both sides of the ankle, and I had that sort of kind of reoccur for a while where it would feel better and it would be like perfectly fine for a while and then it would flare up on me again. So I kind of dealt with that for maybe about a year and a half,
Oh, that's
where I would
frustrating.
have, yeah, I would get pretty consistent. I had a couple good races in that framework too, but it just felt like I didn't have that like same durability that I had historically, where it was like, okay, if I kind of fix this early enough, it'll be done behind me and I don't have to worry about it anymore. And I've had a couple sacral stress fractures, but they were caught very early and they weren't bone density related, where I had like poor bone density. So it was basically just quick bone remodeling. And I was able to get back to running within like the second one. I was like 4 weeks is all I had to take off before I could start running again. So I've had a few injuries where like, other than the ankle thing, I've had a few that had kind of sidelined me for like a month or so, which I've generally just looked at as like, I'm at a point in my running career too where I probably need structured off seasons a little bit more than I did when I was younger. And sometimes they just kind of present themselves with something like that, and you're like, okay, well, I'm just gonna like scale back for a little bit here, let everything catch up that maybe is also kind of subtly lingering behind that could use a little bit of rest, and then ramp back up gradually for the next race. So I've definitely had more hurdles to get over with smaller injuries over the last few years than I did like earlier in my running career. And some of it's I think just like navigating like what I can and can't get away with now that I'm older. I'm 40 now, so it's like there's just going to be things that I have to do differently. So like learning what role cycling plays in a little bit more of a structured
Right.
degree than maybe it did in the past, where
Yeah.
most cross training for me in my 20s, early to mid 30s was basically like, if you have something bother you, maybe you hop on the bike a couple times to close the gap between
Right.
that bothering you and you be able to run effectively again. Now I think it's like, okay, when I start entering the phase of training where I'll be doing like short intervals and long intervals, which I think are very important components to ultra running, even though ultra running's low intensity, I just do them earlier in my training plan. So I have a lot more structured cycling interval workouts that I'm just going to do regardless of whether I'm healthy or injured, because I think they're enough to get what I'm trying to get out of those, and they just reduce the injury risk. And right now, I think reducing the injury risk with those type of training sessions is going to be better value add for me than getting a little bit too creative and trying to do too much on those types of running workouts. So maybe instead of doing like a couple of interval sessions in the week, like I would in that training phase earlier in my career, I might do like one on the bike and, one running. Or when I phase it in, start out on the bike and then gradually phase in the running side of intervals. And then by the end of that training phase, be doing all running intervals, but kind of give myself that ramp up versus kind of jumping in head first, like I was able to do earlier in my career.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of I mean, it's a little bit like unfair because I feel like it takes you like a good 10 to 15 years to really get good at your sport. And then as soon as you hit that, you're aged and you have to like go back and like design it all again and like
Mhm.
refigure it out. But at the same time, I also think it keeps it interesting because there's like all kinds of like different ways to train and learn about your body. And I'm really embracing that now. I'm 46 and I think that it frustrated me at first because I finally felt like I knew what I was doing, but now it's just kind of like fun to bring, like you were talking about, like biking or what, like whatever different things in and just play with it a little bit. I think it keeps it interesting. So
Mhm. Yeah. And it's that the sport evolves on its own too.
yeah,
So it's like I think like ultra running this is on like fast forward because the sport's just less developed, less pressurized from competition compared to like the marathon or any Olympic distance sport. But even the Olympic distance sports, they saw the super shoes come in,
oh yeah,
the newer like carbohydrate strategies, the kind of the reinvention of bicarb through a method that's maybe less gastrointestinally problematic. So like you
yeah,
have all these like new things that are kind of
yeah,
entering too that
always,
have influenced both the training and the just the approaches in general too. So you're always kind of shooting at a moving target with the sport growth
yeah.
as a whole, and then also with your own kind of changes as you age. So it's a fun game we play.
Is there anything that like is really surprising to you, like these days, that maybe when you first started running or coaching is like so different?
Yeah, I would say like probably two big things stand out. One is just I think the value add of things that maybe felt a little non-specific earlier on. So like the cycling example is a good one from my opinion, where my theory of coaching and my theory of training is oftentimes going to typically move closer towards specificity, where if you can develop a skill and create whatever adaptations you're trying to create through the workout structure in a way that's the most specific to the event you're trying to do,
Okay.
that's going to probably be the best, the most fruitful like option to pick up because everything has a trade-off, right? Like anytime I do a
Mhm.
workout, there's dozens of other things I could have done instead of that. So you're always asking yourself why this one versus any of those other ones. And I think that's generally true that like you do want to have a lot of specificity in your training. You want your order of operations to move from least to most specific towards the race intensity you're going to compete at. But at the end of the day, I think there's a lot of wiggle room within that that maybe looks like it's not quite as important as maybe I once thought. So, for example, if I'm training for a 100-mile race, the short interval stuff, like working on my VO2 max, is still important. It's just more important for me to do that earlier in my training so that I can kind of raise that ceiling to the point where when I get to the stuff that's more specific to the 100-mile intensity, I have a lot more tools to play around with while I'm doing the things that are much more specific close to the race itself. But since those are not specific, mechanically driven like processes towards 100-mile racing like they would be for maybe like a 5K or 10K, if I do them on a bike early in my training, I just don't see the big trade-off there with respect to specificity, even though I'm on a bike versus running, and the sport I'm trying to improve at is running, versus the alternative where if I were to say get to the end stage of my training and I'm starting to consolidate volume into shorter periods of time so that I can work on like the durability component of what I'm going to be doing out there on race day, I think it'd be a much bigger trade-off for me to say do a long run and then hop on the bike the next day versus doing something a little bit longer on subsequent days because at that point in training I am trying to get as specific to the specific intensity I'm going to race at. Um, so I think there's always like a lot of interesting questions you want to ask yourself with that, but I've definitely opened my mind a lot more to like, okay, well, it's certainly not the end of the world and probably not even a big deal if I spend some percentage of my short interval time on a bike versus on the track when my goal is to run a fast 100 miler.
Yeah, and it's less impact on your body if you're
Hmm.
doing the bike for those sorts of things.
Yeah.
If you're
Hmm.
doing a running like interval like you're talking about, the like how what is what's the distance that you're running those faster paces at, like in the beginning of your training?
Yeah, yeah. So the way I break it down, like as simply as possible, is my main structure is going to be short intervals tied to VO2 max, 1-to-1 work to rest ratio, generally between 30-second intervals to 4-minute intervals. And then long intervals are going to be like lactate threshold or an intensity I could sustain for around 60 minutes. And those are going to be 2-to-1 work to rest ratio. And they're usually going to range from like 6 minutes up to maybe 15. So usually when I'm working on short intervals, I'm thinking of like the velocity or the pace I'm hitting for those versus like some number that shows up on my watch or in a lab. That number is not all that important to me at this point in my career because I've like basically developed that number to the degree where I'm not going to move it significantly. What's going to move a lot more reliably is the pace I can run from day one to say week 6 of doing short intervals. So historically, like if I can get those short intervals down to something in around like the 440, 445 pace range, I've got that developed enough where like if I were going to try to peak for a 5K, I'd probably want to keep pushing that. But since I'm peaking for a 100 mile, it's like, okay, I've cleared a high enough bar with respect to the development there. It's time to move on to something and start working towards more specific stuff. For the long intervals, it's kind of that same mindset, but the number I'm looking at there is probably a little bit closer to like a 510 to 520 minute mile pace. Where if I can consistently be hitting my long intervals around there, then I'm pretty confident that I don't necessarily need to be pushing that number any lower, unless, of course, I was going to try to peak for a marathon, then maybe I would. But, I usually step away from that development to get more specific towards the 100-mile stuff at that point versus trying to further the progress there.
Makes a lot of sense, actually. I didn't think I was gonna be able to follow that, but it makes a total sense. Um,
Yeah, I
what
think people get too creative with their workout structures
Yeah.
sometimes where they start mixing intensities and they get like maybe a little bit too like let's throw stuff up against the wall and see what works. And I think generally speaking, if someone is doing like an interval session per week, a long run per week, and they're running easy with the volume availability and recovery demands that they have, they're going to be heading in the right direction. So I don't want to tell people like you got to follow the way I do it exactly because consistency is always going to be the biggest variable. And if you have the right order of operations and you're generally hitting the right intensities at the right times and in enough frequency, you're going to get quite a bit of the stuff there. But when you're really trying to get it down to those last few percentage points, I think then you can maybe get a little bit more picky. And I always try to describe it in a way that has it a little more simple, like the 1-to-1 work to rest ratio, the 2-to-1 work to rest ratio, focusing on those two intensities of VO2 max and lactate threshold as your like quality higher end of the aerobic intensity spectrum is just so easy to measure. And you can start to, I think once someone gets a hang of the intensity where their perceived effort is really fine tuned and we've seen the movement that you want with those workouts, I think then you can get a little bit more creative if you want some more excitement versus just the plug and play. I'm doing the same thing every week kind of a mentality.
Right, right. No, that makes sense. And like, I'm glad that you answered it the way you did. At first, I was thinking like, because you're training for such a longer distance than a marathon, if your short intervals were going to be like longer than what I expected. But I mean, they're pretty similar to if you were training for a marathon. The time and distance that you're doing for short intervals is still, pretty similar. What do you run a marathon in, or have you run one recently, or trained and run one, or?
It's been a while actually since I've actually entered an actual structured marathon. I didn't really ever do a proper marathon training build. I've probably run over a dozen 230 marathons in my career, whether they were like 230 to 232-ish in some structured events, and then probably a half a dozen in training just on my own. But I've never really pushed beyond that. So yeah, I mean that's kind of like the development phase of like when I get to that point, I'm usually turning my attention towards the 100-mile development side of things versus trying to push the marathon further down. I haven't even done a structured marathon in super shoes. It's been a while since I've actually jumped in an event. So maybe it's time to jump into a marathon just for the
Yeah,
fun of it and see what I can
come to
do. And
Indy. You should go
yeah.
do Indy in November. Like, are there other distances that, like, do you think what do you think is the hardest distance? Like of all, like I love the marathon, but I happen to think the 5K is like really hard. Like, what do you like?
Yeah.
Do you have a distance that you think is like actually the hardest?
Yeah, I actually think the marathon probably is just because I think it's the perfect balance of, I mean, it always depends on what you do with it, right? Like you can make a
Yeah.
5K incredibly difficult. You can make a 100 mile incredibly difficult. You can make a marathon incredibly difficult. It really just depends on like how much you want to put into it. The way I describe it is if you take any one of those events to their conclusion where you've spent years and years and years trying to fine tune it to the point where you just get to the point where like, yeah, I just can't go any faster than that no matter what I
Mhm.
do. That's going to be a very difficult effort. And getting to that
Yeah.
point, it gets more and more difficult because you're grabbing for tiny little slivers with what feels like insane amount of additional work. So I think like the hard question with events is really just dependent on how much attention someone wants to pay to it.
Yeah.
But if we just normalize all of that and say you're taking all of these events to that end game, I still think the marathon maybe stands out just because it has this like it's like this perfect intensity where everything is still quite important. You have to blend it in a really creative way.
Yeah.
So I find events where you can be a little bit more you can be a little more exact with respect to, I guess maybe I should say like events that fall closer to one end of the aerobic intensity spectrum or the other. Those I think are those ones don't stand out as much to me because that's got a fairly defined endpoint that is going to like lopside the training towards something a little bit more specific than say the marathon is kind of like smack dab in the middle almost for a lot of people. So I'd probably give it to that if I had to.
If you haven't heard, Charm City Run has a fresh new look, and we are so excited to share it with you. For 24 years, Charm City Run has been serving runners and walkers across Maryland and Delaware, and we're just getting started. Whether you're just starting out or chasing a PR, we've got everything you need across our 7 retail locations. Stop in for a free expert shoe fitting, browse our fabulous apparel, and let our team help you find your perfect run. But Charm City Run has always been more than a store. It's a community. This summer, our training groups are kicking off, and we'd love for you to join us. From 5K programs to half and full marathon training, there's a group for every goal and every pace. With summer running in full swing, Charm City Run has some of the best finish lines around. Check out their races at charmcityrun.com/race. Whether you're looking for your first 5K or your 100th race, they've got a race to work towards. Head to charmcityrun.com to find your nearest location, register for a training group, or sign up for a race. We'll see you out there. So if like an athlete were to look at their own data, like how could we look at our data and find a weak point? Like what will we be looking at?
Yeah, yeah. I think if you can control the environment enough and do like some just tests and training where I mean there's a bunch of different ways to do this. I'll tell you the ways I look at it. I'll have someone do like a 12-minute time trial, a 30-minute time trial. We'll look at their pace at like just a really easy, relaxed run, and then their pace that's kind of a little closer to their zone two, where it's like they can go quite a bit with it, but they feel like they're working a little bit more than just a super relaxed, easy recovery run and then get a little bit of a profile on them across the aerobic intensity spectrum with those kind of 4 types of intensities. And usually something will stand out there if there's something that's worth addressing sooner rather than later. And yeah, I mean, some people come in with a pretty well-rounded setup where it's like, okay, there's not like these huge gaps that we see between, or there's not this like these skewed windows between those intensities. It just has like a pretty predictable trend line, which that just means that person is kind of set up where we need to look at what's the race they're doing, what's the intensity and the demands of that race, and then the order of operations is going to be least to most specific because they've already sort of kind of balanced things out a little bit more. There is a question that people should probably always ask too with respect to volume because volume improves quite a bit. There is definitely like a lowering of value by adding more at a certain point. But things I tell people is like really what you want to do is you want to make sure you get your quality work in, and then you can fill in the rest with easy, low intensity training and the end point of that is often going to be like how much time do you have to dedicate to this because we don't win by saying here's a 15-hour training week when the most time you can dedicate consistently is 10 hours a week. So a lot of times people's lifestyles dictate like where that number ends at, but then where they're at initially too, because we want to make sure we're increasing those in a sustainable manner, kind of work that up along the way. So yeah, it's going to be a little bit of an individual case by case depending on some of those lifestyle factors and then where they're at currently versus where they want to be.
So you do the coaching, and then you're doing your events. And I know right now you are dealing with. Can we talk a little bit about your like blood clot and what's going on? Like, how did that develop, and like, how did you know, and like, where are you with that?
Yeah, that was a new experience. So, I felt like it was kind of funny. I felt like before that happened, I was kind of just looking or reflecting on just like everything that's gone into my running career so far. And I was like, like there's always that expression of like, okay, I've seen everything now. And I was getting closer to feeling somewhat comfortable with that sort of a mindset of like, I've seen so many things now. And like I kind of have at least a good idea of like who to ask or where to go if something starts coming up because it's not as novel as maybe it was the first time it happened to me. This was like a total new experience. I came out of left field where yeah, I mean, I had just finished my training cycle. I was about a week and a half into the tape. I do a 2 week taper usually before a 100-mile race. So I was about a week and a half into it. And I was getting on a flight to go to, I'm living in Austin. The race was in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. So my parents lived like 3 miles from the facility that was hosting the event. And so I was flying to Milwaukee. My flight got delayed. I got in like really late that night, like midnight. So I wake up that next morning. It was Friday morning. So I was like 48 hours out from the race. I was just going to do like a 45-minute easy shakeout run. And as I was doing that run, I started noticing as everything I kind of loosened up, my left calf started like getting progressively tighter. At first, I thought like, I think I strained my calf. But I didn't have like that. Like I've strained my calf before. I had actually had an upper calf strain earlier in the training cycles. And that's one of the reasons why that popped into my mind. But it had been like I think it was like 3 months and it was pretty minor. It was like I took a few days off, hopped on the bike, and it was pretty much fine from there. I didn't really notice it at all during the rest of the training. So I thought it was kind of odd that it popped up then. So at that point I was like, okay, well, this race maybe not happening. I can't really start a 100-miler with a strained calf and expect it not to become an issue that derails things. So I was already thinking like, all right, I'm probably going to have to pull out of this race unless I can really figure something out or this ends up being just something really goofy that clears up. So I waited 24 hours just to see if it resolved on its own, without pulling out of the race. And then the next morning when I woke up, it was like even worse. So at that point, I knew I was a day from the race. I was like, I'm not starting the race with this. Didn't even bother trying running that morning. Pulled out of the race, and I was at home with my parents, so I was planning on staying for about a week anyway, and just hanging out with family. So I'm just like, well, I guess I'm going to see them for a little bit more when I don't have this race to do in the middle of it all. And at that point, I was still thinking it was probably a calf strain, but it started presenting differently at that point where it wasn't just like, okay, I've got this swelling and this discomfort in the area when I'm kind of moving and putting weight on it and having this kind of like swelling coming and going. It was like a constant upper calf swelling. And I had this really low level of discomfort that was like, it wasn't like super painful, but it was just like constantly there, just this low level, like throbbing, regardless of whether I was walking, sitting, standing, laying. And that kind of like just so much different than anything else I've seen. So at that point, between like people online, my sister's a nurse, she was there, and like every other person that was like in my family was like, yeah, maybe it's time just to go in and get it looked at just to rule out blood clot. So I went into the urgent care. I still assumed it wasn't a blood clot at that point in time. Well, and it's just one of those things where I know enough about blood clots where I know you don't want to sit on them for a while because it just it gets just like progressively worse the longer you wait, and then it gets to a point where it's exponentially problematic with respect to I mean, you could die of a pulmonary embolism essentially. So like that's like the worst case. Yeah. So it's like one of those things where it's like it'd be silly not to rule it out. So especially given that I was getting on a flight on that following Wednesday. So I went into urgent care, described to them everything. Like, okay, we're just gonna do an ultrasound, see what's going on. They ran the ultrasound, and in like 10 minutes, I'm like sitting in this like ultrasound room. They've been gone for 10 minutes. All of a sudden, this nurse comes in with a wheelchair. I'm like, all right, they don't think it's a calf strain, I guess. So and she like looks at me and she's like, this is just 100% preventative. We've seen you walking around, so we think you're probably fine. But their minds all go to like, there's a active clot. If something ruptures, that's when it turns into a pulmonary embolism. Let's not risk anything by having him walking around and putting weight on it. So they wheel me into the room and they kind of break everything down to me. And they're like, you have a clot that is like from your ankle up to your mid thigh. We're sending you to the ER right away to get it looked at further to determine what to do next. And thankfully, they imaged from like my right groin over to my left groin all the way down my leg. So they got a really good mapping of where it started and where it finished versus like just not knowing where it ended. Maybe if they had just kind of looked at the calf area where I had the discomfort presenting, because that's the only spot I had any pain. It wasn't like my ankles didn't hurt, my thigh didn't hurt, nothing was problematic with that. So they took me to the ER. They looked at the imaging. They ran some labs and determined that it was a partial blockage. So I was still getting blood flow to my foot. I was producing a pulse down in my feet. So they were like, they basically in that scenario, they give you a blood thinner and send you out and just say, go see your doctor back at home and start exploring what the causes were and what the next steps are from there. But had I waited any longer, it could have spread up into my pelvis, which is when it gets a little more complicated, and then you end up in there overnight and they're injecting you with stuff and they're maybe going in the back of your knee and pulling it out and that sort of stuff. So yeah, so it's been a bit of a journey since then too, because like now I was kind of like, okay, well, I'm good for now, but what do I do next? So I I saw my primary care physician here in Austin, talked to a vascular surgeon, met with a hematologist. I've got more labs that I'm still waiting on some labs that will highlight whether there's potentially some sort of genetic predisposition, because with clots they want to confirm as best they can whether it's provoked or unprovoked. And unprovoked, as far as I understand, is usually like, okay, we don't really have a reason for you to have gotten a blood clot other than maybe you have a higher genetic predisposition to them. There's something called a factor V gene you want to rule out. So I've had all that lab work done. I'm just waiting to get it read by the hematologist and told to me. But based on the progress of it, like the swelling's basically all gone. The discomfort was gone basically after I'd been on the blood thinners for 2 or 3 days. So the hematologist was like, like if we felt like the clot wasn't progressing the way we'd want to from the blood thinners and everything you're doing around it, then we would probably want to, go in and get more imaging right away and explore some options of maybe going in there and actually removing the clot. Because you do have about a 4-week window to do that before it gets a lot harder to pull the clot out. So I've so far I've basically had one of the like smoothest possible scenarios with respect to this issue that you can have. Hopefully it continues to be that way, but I actually got cleared to bike and do low impact cardio stuff last week. I got cleared to run next week. It's kind of funny. It's like as soon as you get on the blood thinners, unless there's some like standout concern or like progressed into your pelvis or you've had a pulmonary embolism, you can pretty much start resuming your training a lot sooner than you'd probably think based on how dire it maybe looks at first.
I mean, your attitude around the whole thing is just like super impressive to me because I feel like, you trained so long for an event. I know that you were training for the dome, some dome thing. I don't
Six
know what
days
it's
in the
called. The
dome.
six
Yeah, yeah,
days
yeah.
in the dome. And I don't, how long was that training? I mean, that you were doing for it? Like, was that like 4 6 months, 4 months?
Yeah, it was technically probably 6 months, but I had a little bit of a longer off season. I ended up there's like I actually my wife and I were joking around because we both had a few things this year that we had to go into the doctor for, and like we've basically like exceeded our lifetime doctor appointments in like half of a year. And we're like that part of that's good because like we hit our deductible and then it's like, okay, let's get
Right.
all this over with. But like
Right.
earlier in the there's this in Central Texas they have this cedar oak pollen that
Mm.
it's like an allergy and you don't notice it if you're susceptible to it. It's pretty rare that you like, I guess you could be very severely allergic to it, but usually what happens is like if you've been in Austin or Central Texas for a while, you're on like year 3, year 4, year 5, 6, 7. The timeline ranges and you start getting symptoms. They're basically like asthmatic symptoms where
Oh.
like you feel like you're having a hard time breathing when you start kind of pushing things. So I started noticing that in mid-January when I started kind of ramping back up after an off season. And at first I thought like, oh man, maybe I really overcooked that last training cycle and I'm just
Right.
kind of a little fried and need to like chill out for a little bit longer. I did this workout. It was just like an easy run or like a base run, like zone 2 run with some pickups in it. And I was just getting destroyed by the pickups. I'm like, this is
Right.
okay. Like, I know I'm
I know.
starting the training cycle, but this isn't anything I've noticed before.
Right.
So like I got looked at with that, and they determined that I had like I'm pretty allergic to the cedar oak pollen.
Mm.
So it took a while to get to that because it's never like overnight. It's usually like multiple weeks by the time they like start getting around to
Yeah.
ordering the tests, getting the tests, figuring out what it is, and then, getting you like whatever medication you need to deal with the allergies. So I kind of had that to navigate in like kind of the January, February timeframe that kept the training a little bit more like unpredictable, where I
Right.
probably would have started kind of that short interval stuff I described earlier around that time. But at this point, it was basically like easy intensity runs felt fine. But if I started doing intervals, it was just like I was breathing through a straw, and it just felt like it was just a waste of time to even try at a certain point. So waiting to kind of get all that stuff cleared up was a little bit of a hurdle to get over in the beginning part of the season. But I really did kind of hit the gas pedal in around mid-March with respect to being
Okay.
have all my training kind of options on the table, so to speak. So I spent a good portion of, March, April, May, and the first week in June, really kind of dialing in training and putting in some pretty heavy work for that phase for the race itself. So yeah, I didn't get to express any of that or explore what I did with the training for this race, but
Yeah.
um, since I should be able to kind of get back into things pretty quick here, um, I'm hopeful that that'll be kind of a good baseline to have for a build up towards something this fall if things all keep going in the right direction.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I was just pointing out, like you go through like such an intense period. You said you had a good training cycle, so for something to pop up when you're like on your way to the race, most people would just, I mean, it would drive me crazy. Like I would just be freaking out. But I mean, it seems, I mean, obviously, I don't know what your state was at the time, but like it just seems like you just handled it kind of all in stride, which is um, also one of the things that really inspires me about like high like level athletes like you seem to be able to handle these things like much easier than a lot of us can. So
Yeah, I mean, I think I have a unique entry to the sport, kind of similar to what we were talking about before, where a lot of the stuff I'm doing now, I would have never imagined even having the opportunity to do. I mean, even when I got into running, I had no clue what an ultra marathon was until I was in college and racing collegiately and things like that. So it's like part of it is just like when I'm honest with myself, when I look back and think like, man, look at all the opportunities and successes that I've had, and it's like it is one of those things where like I have to be honest with myself where like, hey, if I can't compete professionally and try to PR in certain races going forward because I had a blood clot or whatever it happens to be, or I just miss an opportunity in a race or things like that. It's like, yeah, you don't want it. You're not excited about that. But it is one of those things where it's like you kind of have to look at it through the lens of if you're doing things as long as I have with running, you are going to have a lot of different scenarios present themselves, and some are going to be great. Like in my case, I've broken some world records, and other times it's going to be like I did 4 months of really hard training and then scratched at the start line, essentially.
that's where that zoom
So,
out skill comes in,
yeah,
right? Like
exactly,
you're zooming out and looking at the
exactly.
whole picture. Definitely hope everything continues to go smoothly with figuring this out and just we'll be following along and hoping everything is okay. Um, I know we're running up on time here, but I have a couple like fun questions. Do you have like 5 more minutes?
Yeah,
Okay,
absolutely.
cool. All right, awesome. So I know that you were on the Joe Rogan podcast, I think in 2019, which he's so awesome. I love his show. Is there like a particular question that he asked that like you thought was like a really good question, or like what was your favorite thing that he asked you?
Yeah, I can't remember if he asked this exactly, but it's just kind of a theme that I think kind of drives his show, which he gets very curious about a specific topic, and then he identifies like somebody who he thinks can like answer some of the questions. So like he's like, I can just have him on my show because I'm the biggest podcast in the world. So why wouldn't I just bring him in and ask him this? So like I think like one of the things he wanted to try to understand with me, which wasn't unsimilar with like when he had Courtney DeWalter on.
Mm,
I think he was looking for the answers to some of these questions too, which is sort of like your why is what we would probably call it in the running community is like, what is the deal with these people that gets them to move so far out their comfort zone voluntarily? Because when you think of just like the level of just anguish you kind of have to go to optimize for performance in any sport really, but then ultra running has this like almost mystical like duration element to it of
Yeah.
just like, wow, you're really going into the unknown here.
Right.
Because we just have explored it maybe less specifically and less scientifically. And I think he was just trying to kind of figure out like, what is that? What goes,
Mm.
why do you, and maybe there's this like element of like someone like Joe's looking at it from the outside a lot of times. I think he maybe looks into it from his like kind of mixed martial artist, like MMA lens, where it's like, there's not as much like bravado in the sport of ultra running, but then you get someone like Courtney Dauwalter, who's an absolute savage out there on a race course. It's like, how do those two personalities coexist?
Oh yeah.
Versus like maybe a Conor McGregor personality where he's this like larger than life, like call you out, like, call this shot type of a character.
Yeah, it's
But
very
then,
different. Yeah.
yeah, but then Joe also has the whole like, yeah, he'll talk about this a lot too, where you get the fighting culture of like jujitsu or mixed martial arts, where there is this like level of respect and this level of like understanding. Like you hold this skill set that is quite lethal, and you need to be mindful of that, and also recognize you're vulnerable to that. And if you're engaged in that world, it's like any sport. You're always going to find someone who's bigger and badder and better.
Right.
So you come across that person and it can humble you very quickly. So you do get this element of just confidence and humbleness blended together. So I think he's oftentimes interested in that element with respect to like athleticism and physical feats, as well as like where does that kind of blend show up versus other sports that he's maybe more familiar with.
Yeah. Well, it does though, because like anytime you get too like full of yourself and running, I mean, you get humbled by the sport. Just the sport
Yeah,
does it. It's not another person. It's just, you have a bad
right.
race or, whatever. So, yeah. How did you, how did you answer that? Like for you, like what's in it for you?
Yeah, I think like my answer to that question, I can't remember how I answered it exactly, but I think what I was trying to get at with whatever I said on that interview, I've refined over the years as I've just kind of thought about it myself more
Yeah.
too. And I think it's really just it kind of just comes down to, I was really curious about ultra marathon running as this avenue of the sport that I grew up loving, but wasn't going to have a professional career in. To, okay, well, here's a part of the sport of running that I really enjoy the most, which is like the long run that actually optimizes for that. And I can be good at it. Like I can go and like run well enough where brands want to support those efforts. And I think where that really kind of opened up for me was in 2013 when I ran that 100-mile American record. And like when I finished that race, I knew I could go faster.
Hmm.
um, and I knew I was close enough to the world record where it was like, okay, I need to see how fast I can do this. And breaking the world record along the way would be an awesome kind of target to use as motivation as well. But ultimately, like the question I was asking myself was like, how fast can I run this 100-mile race? And I mean, that's just a question that has just drawn I've just continued to ask myself that with as much excitement and curiosity as I did that first day when I thought about it. So that's kind of that's sort of my North Star, I think, with how long I want to kind of pursue that. I mean, it could be something where I'm still curious about the what if, because I'm in a growing sport where, like there's always things you can look at now that think what we know now and be like, oh, if I would have done that, I would have been faster. I mean, I think it's working with what you have within a growing sport and understanding that nothing's going to be perfect, but if you did everything you could, you find where you end up. And that's kind of that end point that I'm talking about.
I mean, it makes a lot of sense to me, especially because you have the Performance Outliers podcast. You're interested in pushing yourself, and you're interested in people who do the same thing and are kind of outliers. Um, and so you've had some interesting guests on your show. I remember I emailed you at some point, just so fascinated by somebody you had on talking about the marathon monks. Are there other athletes that you think are more, let's see, intense than the monks that you've talked about or learned about on your show?
They're up there. Yeah, I think they might be the ultimate example. I think the sport has, because you need this perfect recipe of, you need to have enough competitive pressure to really drive out what the human potential is. you need that recipe of like what is the structure that allows for that to really get as absurd as like the marathon monks like protocol is. So you almost have to have a system in place that scaffolds like the grandness of the achievement, but then you also have to have the people to do it. So I actually think maybe the backyard ultra is probably the closest to it right now in the sport if we're looking at like more event specific stuff,
Okay.
because that kind of has like no endpoint. It's like it's going to go as long as it goes. I mean, I guess you're where it maybe diverges is you're reliant on one other person, because as soon as you're the last man or woman standing, you don't get to go as far as you could. You could have kept going, and that's why you're the last person standing. So then I maybe look at some of the FKT stuff or some of these large projects that just take a tremendous amount of time, and I think of the one that stands out to me that I don't think I've seen anything as impressive as this yet is Pete Koselnick. Ran from Alaska to Florida, self-supported. It was like I think it was like almost 6,000 miles or something
What?
like that. And he averaged 50 miles a day, and it wasn't like, okay, I'm just gonna like churn out my 50 miles, pushing this stroller with all my gear in it, and then the next day, get up out of my hotel room and do 50 more. It was like he's up in Alaska to start. So it's like, all right, I guess I'm sleeping on the side of this road tonight. And oh well, today I better go 85 miles because that's where my next resupply is. And then the next day I can only go 22 miles because my next resupply for a huge chunk of time is there. And if I go past that, then I'm in this like weird pinch point where I'm not going to have what I need. So it's like this logistical nightmare on top of this massive physical feat. And I mean, he did that on like kind of the back end of breaking the Transcon record, where he ran from San Francisco to New York in basically exactly 6 weeks. It was 42 days and 6 hours. And that's 72 and a half miles a day. Yeah. And I mean, he even had to take a day off early on. Like he got a little too aggressive in the first week and was averaging like 80 miles a day and like kind of jacked up I think it was like the front of his ankle from the incline, because he was living in Nebraska at the time and probably just didn't do quite as much incline running. So he was going over the Sierras and just exerted that mechanic a little bit and took a full day off and then got back to it and then ended up averaging 72 and a half miles with a day off amongst that 6 week time frame. So it's just like those two efforts in proximity to one another. If we're looking for marathon monk level like examples in modern day ultra running, that's got to be it. I just can't think of anything that's really gotten to that duration and just like the stuff that like it's intentionally non-optimized, right? Because you're just never going to you can never possibly have enough support to make it as comfortable as it could be if you sunk like millions and millions of dollars into it and had like literally like doctors following you with like mobile units of support.
It's like we could get a bunch of these people together and have like a Survivor reality show, but for like ultra marathoning. They could just
Yeah.
see how far they could go unsupported. It'd be crazy. Well, what is the last question I have is like, what is a question that you like to ask people that inspire you? Like, do you have a favorite question that you ask your guests?
That's a good question. I don't know if I have one. I think like when I have a guest on the podcast, it's usually because a specific question or topic popped up that I was like, oh, I want to hear more about that. And
Mm.
that's ranged a lot. And I definitely go through phases where I'll get obsessed with something. And then it's like, okay, I'm going to continue like going down this rabbit hole. So like some examples of that were like some of the multi-day stuff, just trying to get into the head of how they're thinking about things like sleep. Like the nutrition side of things has always been one that's been ongoing for me. So some of the higher carb approaches have been that's one that I've been asking a lot about recently, because I think there's this like traditional thought process where like most of it's just like oxidation defense with carbohydrate intake. But as we learn more about it, it becomes more and more clear, even though we don't know the exact mechanisms or the exact reasoning, but there is a performance aspect of just ingesting carbohydrate outside of it defending whatever oxidation demands you have from it. So, like, kind of figuring out kind of where that range is for a lot of these top performances is a reoccurring question I've asked a lot about recently. Yeah, I mean, I think just like one maybe that kind of pops up a lot, especially with the ultra running stuff, is just trying to kind of figure out a little bit of like, what's their purpose, what's their why, what are they, what drew them into it that got them interested? Because I got to think like a lot of these people have a similar scenario to me, where like you had this experience where it was like, well, that's a calling and I'm going to follow it as long as I stay motivated. Like I just had a guy on the podcast recently, George, he just won the Comrades
Hmm.
marathon in South
Yeah.
Africa. Super interesting guy, competitive runner. I mean, he was like a 147, 800 runner at 17. So he had a lot of like promise within the sport. And then he decided to focus on comrades. And, a guy like that, I think more traditionally, you probably see it at an Olympic distance type event, but he
Mhm.
decided to focus in on comrades. So kind of figuring out like, what was it about comrades? Like
Yeah.
why that race versus other things, and getting an idea of like what drew them to what they got interested in the first place.
Yeah, I think it's so funny to interview different people, and it always goes in different directions. Like our conversation went in directions that I didn't anticipate, wasn't on my plan. It was great. But it always starts with like I kind of want to know like why people got into running, what our life like looked like before running. Especially people, a lot of people have stories where like they had something happen and they run now and whether that was an addiction or whatever. Like it just everybody has such a fascinating story. That's why I love just getting to meet people, and I feel like the podcast is such a great way to just, like, put, like, out, like, a little, like, "Hey, can we connect?"
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
really, like, excited to have connected with you and appreciate your time, and, yeah, again, like, we'll be following along, wishing you the best of luck in what you have coming up. I know you're probably just trying to wait and see what's going on with your health right now, but then, yeah, do you have anything that you're looking ahead to maybe in the fall, or are you just kind of at this point waiting to see what happens?
Yeah, I'm not giving it some thought. I think like Tunnel Hill makes a lot of sense to me if things continue to progress the way they have. That's in like kind of early to mid November. So the
Okay.
timeline I think would be fine. And since I haven't had to take a significant time off entirely, I should be able to get back to like proper training in enough time to peak for it. So if I don't have any curveballs pop up, that kind of keeps me from doing the work that's necessary to go for a fast time at that race. That one would stand out. I could punt it further down if I wanted like a similarly fast type of race to December for Desert Solstice, which I've
Sure.
done a bunch of times in the past too. I mean, I've kind of learned that you probably don't want to do both of them. They're just close enough proximity where like you're gonna pay. One of them's gonna go badly.
Right. It's not worth it.
So that might be a hot stove I try to touch again at some point, but we'll see. I'm not going to put it on the calendar ahead of time. We'll make game time decision with that one going forward. But yeah, there's a lot of good fall kind of like early winter races that kind of match what I like to do. I would like to do Javelina again at some point, hopefully before I get too old and I'm looking at it through the lens of okay, it's never going to be as good as it once was. But that's a course I always like. That kind of gets me a little bit more of the trail aspect, even though it's a very runnable trail course relative to some of them that you see.
Awesome. So lots of exciting stuff, and you have to promise to let me know if you run a marathon. Maybe you can come to Baltimore and run the Baltimore Marathon. It's a tough one. So, yeah, definitely keep me posted there.
Awesome. Yeah. It'd be fun to, even if it's just for training, jump in a couple here and there.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. All right, Zach. Well, I appreciate your time and look forward to staying connected. So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me on.
And that's a wrap on today's episode of Maybe Running Will Help. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you enjoyed this episode, please take a moment to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast. It helps us reach more listeners just like you. And don't forget to share this episode with a friend who might need a little inspiration to get moving. Until next time, keep running, keep inspiring, and keep sharing how maybe running will help. Have a great run, everybody.